there's been a consciousness in government that the beneficiaries of public policy ought to be consulted, that they ought to be involved in the policy formulation process as a way of ensuring sustainable implementation. That is the greatest legacy of the NESG.
"18 years ago, a group of courageous business executives intent on throwing off the chains of economic state control challenged Nigeria's military rulers to open up the country's economy.
At the time we intervened, Nigeria was like trying to exclude itself from the rest of the world. We were closing our borders. We were banning all kinds of things, we were not relating well with the rest of the world. And we were probably going to, go into extinction if we continued in that direction.
They were driven by necessity, overwhelmed by the spectacular mismanagement of the economy and the repressive policies of the military.
We were to do a roundtable with the federal government. It was a military regime. All the investors from foreign countries have come, and then that year, the day we were to kick off, somebody came with a letter to me that, sorry, government has cancelled the roundtable. And you could have knocked me down with a feather.
They questioned the military order, becoming at once Nigeria's first economic mutineers.
I think really, in fact, once the world economic situation changed with the collapse of the Soviet system and centralized planning and the market-driven economies came on top, no more opposition. Thinking here in Nigeria, began to evolve.
They didn't know it then, but they had become the pioneers of the most dramatic economic change in Nigeria. And the independent non-profit organization they formed, known as the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, would help to shape the historical direction of the Nigerian economy for years to come. In the early 1990s, after a decade of declining fortunes under successive military governments, Nigeria's economy had become a wasteland of inefficient state enterprises, decaying infrastructure, widespread insecurity, and high levels of poverty.
The Nigerian economy was actually in very stormy waters. Because most of the macroeconomic indices were headed south. Inflation was very, very rampant. Interest rate was going through the roof. And there was abject poverty, ignorance, and disease all around.
By mid-1993, months of social unrest had disfigured the country's economy on an epic scale. Nigeria was in tatters, mired in unbelievable austerities, following the worst political crisis since the Civil War. The formalities of red tape were everywhere, and businessmen had to go through dozens of government agencies to manage their enterprises.
We are running a sort of regulated economy where you have to have licenses before you can even import anything, or before you can get the necessary foreign exchange to pay for this thing. So part of my time, which I should have been used for productive activities, were spent in the lobbies of the ministers' offices, sitting down waiting to see one minister or the other to be able to convince them that, well, my request should be granted for licenses, and it was such a difficult period.
There was a growing sense amongst business leaders that a tipping point was fast approaching, and that some sort of resistance was necessary against the increasingly untenable economic order.
In the 1993-94 era, There were political issues, there were economic issues. Nigeria was in a tough situation. And the private sector leaders said, do we just fold our hands, complain, and watch this country go down? We need to do something.
And we wanted to bring economic policy formulation as a discipline in governance. That time, that was what we were preaching. Okay. And also, we're also preaching the removal of government draconian hands on the economy.
As the sense of economic uncertainty deepened, Nigeria's business leaders resolved that it was time for a radical new approach to economic development.
At a garden party in the residence of the British High Commissioner of Nigeria, I think in 1991 or 1992, some of us got talking.
I would mention Ernest Shonekan, the former head of state, Joseph Sanusi, former governor of the central bank. Clearly, people like Dick Kramer, Pascal Dozier, Bunyoni of Cadbury, Imo Isweli, Dotun Suleiman, and quite a couple of other people like Faisal El Khalil. And very importantly, we must not forget that even though they have left the country, chief executive officers of major multinational companies, ranging from oil and gas to manufacturing to services.
Idika Kalu, there was the representative of the World Bank then, some managing directors of 2 banks. Some of these were foreigners. Chris Eze of John Holt at the time. There was Brian Anderson, who was managing director of Shell.
The first thing we did was to create a platform for dialogue, because we thought that you cannot solve any problem, especially national issues, until you got as many people, I wouldn't say everybody on board, as many people as possible to listen to the different viewpoints and different perspectives so that economic planning can be rigorous. And at the end of the day, we can come out with something which can stand the test of time.
They rose from their meeting determined to challenge state controls of the economic system and to advocate a complete renegotiation of the rules that governed the economy. It was a direct attack on the military government's development policy, and it became one of the most revolutionary times in the history of the Nigerian economy.
You had the military who, working with a handful of civilians, would churn out policies, would churn out decrees without any consultation. And so that and those tendencies and the kinds of policies that resulted therefrom tended to stifle economic development. And so what happened was that a group of very courageous business leaders at the time then emerged and said, well, gentlemen, yes, you have political power, but we believe that we can provide better support so that at least you don't really destroy this economy.
There was no parallel for their unprecedented call for change, and many bureaucrats were not easily persuaded to abandon decades of state controls.
It was a tough start, right? Knowing that the military guys who were in power then didn't think much about the private sector.
There were some people in the public sector to whom profit was anathema, if you see what I mean. And they regarded us. They didn't see us as wanting the good things they want for Nigeria. We wanted to make them understand that, if anything, we want even better things for Nigeria than they can never imagine themselves, because unless Nigeria thrives and develops, we will not be in business.
The underlying issues that were identified in terms of the diagnosis was the notion that the public and private sector were so far apart in terms of how we saw Nigeria and what kind of solutions were needed to move Nigeria forward. And so we realized that first and foremost, it was important for us to start talking to each other in order to bridge the communication gap.
One of the most influential of these change agents was Chief Ernest Shonikan, chairman of the United Africa Company, or UAC, the largest conglomerate in Nigeria at the time.
The private sector looked at the public sector as the cog in the wheel of progress, and the public sector also looked at the private sector as the ones that makes the ugly face of capitalism. They make all the money with the view to helping their employers to cut the money away.
So he gathered a few of us around and said we should try and do something and develop this think tank and see how it can evolve and impact economic policy.
Shonikan posted the business community's demands for change, which called for the military government to loosen controls of the economy and to open it up to the free market. The business world was essentially advocating a fundamental shift of economic power from the bureaucratic public sector to an unfettered private sector, a move they believed would transform Nigeria. They braced themselves for a period of confrontation, but the military government of General Ibrahim Babangida, which was under siege from both local and international critics for postponing a promised handover of power to civilians, astonished business leaders by reaching out to them.
Babangida was the first president. When we held the first summit group in Abuja, he attended the meeting. He stayed there for most of the time with his cabinet.
Babangida was impressed. He appointed Shonikan as the head of his transitional council. A few months later, following his inexplicable decision to annul the 1993 presidential elections, Babangida was forced to step aside, and Shonikan took his place, the first business leader ever to become head of state. Not only was it an iconic moment, there was a sense of a strategic realignment in Nigeria's economic affairs.
Time was right with him going in to head the transitional government to really develop a strong public-private partnership. It was kind of fortuitous because Bill Clinton was elected president in the United States in November of 1992, and he had a 2 or 3 day economic summit to kind of build the credibility and the game plan for his administration. And Chief saw that and said, hey, that would be something we can do as part of the Transition Council.
That first summit also led to the creation of the world-famous Lagos Business School, whose mission was to impart world-class international business knowledge that's relevant to Nigeria. It was an auspicious start for the business community. Never before had the private sector, both Nigerian and non-Nigerian, come together with all 3 levels of government to develop an economic strategy for the country. There was a sense of being on a historic mission, with Shonikan leading the charge.
And he gave us about 60 to 90 days to get our act together. And we really looked at chief executives and people we knew and different things and brought them together into a group where I think its distinguishing feature was that everybody was willing to work hard at doing it, but not for their own self-interest, because they wanted to put together a good game plan for Nigeria.
But it didn't last long. Barely 3 months later, Shonikan's political career was over, forcibly truncated by another military ruler, General Sani Abacha. However, the brief interregnum of civilian governance had managed to bring the public and private sectors to an understanding of their interdependence, and the alliance opened the way for a new approach to economic development. By the time General Abacha came to power in late 1993, it was clear to most observers that military rule had not delivered prosperity, but had left the economy in ruins. If the country was going to move forward, economic growth had to triumph over political ideology. And so business leaders decided to build on what had been achieved during Shonikan's short term as head of state.
And then we now turn this round and start having what we call Business Nigeria. A group of us meeting once a month in lunch to discuss how do we want this country to look like. At the same time, you had Harvard Business School Alumni Association also doing their own thing. Then we used to also have what we called monthly dinner club, which we met once every one Thursday every month.
It was still as a club, an informal club of people meeting. Then they now decided to bring a young man, Chris Onyemenam, who is running now the National Identity Program. They brought him as more or less an executive secretary, they called it, of the NESG. But it was really servicing the informal meetings and so on.
Meanwhile, those informal meetings had set off a much broader movement whose membership was made up of some of the most successful captains of industry in Nigeria. They agreed to formalize the meetings into something more permanent, and the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, or NESG, was born. But it wasn't until 1996 that the NESG became officially registered as a non-profit think tank.
I became the first chairman for 6 years of the Economic Summit Group, and Dick as a vice chairman. But really, can you say that Dick and I were the soul and heart of the summit group? No. We just played our own part. There were other people who were also involved.
We had a phrase, we called it, we don't have no high tables, we just have work tables. And the work both of people in government, which of course was military at that time, and private sector, was just spending all hours to get things done. And I think the methods we used of groupthink and discussion and coming up with solutions and all, and the kind of people we were willing to assemble, made a big difference in the whole thing.
Late General Abacha came to power, and we decided, to engage him, and he was quite receptive. And funnily enough, despite the reputation and the way he managed the affairs of the country, he was very, very receptive to the recommendations.
One of the key recommendations of the newly formed Nigerian Economic Summit Group was for the public and private sectors to hold annual economic summits and for them to jointly come up with a document that would set the economic agenda for Nigeria into the 21st century.
We did not expect in our wildest dreams a year before that time that any government would buy that idea.
But the military ruler, General Abacha, did. He overcame the opposition of the bureaucrats and declared a new era of economic reform.
The government was bold and courageous enough to buy that idea, and by God, within a period of 12 months, we put together easily, and by most accounts, the best economic, social, and blueprint that this nation would ever have. That is the Vision 2010 document.
Vision 2010 was a long-term free market development plan for Nigeria. Crafted by more than 200 leaders and thinkers from a broad range of backgrounds, the document set out a 15-year economic, social and political roadmap that aimed to position Nigeria at the top of the pecking order in Africa by 2010.
The Economic Summit Group was really at the back of the Vision 2010 exercise. And many people have vilified or had some strong words about General Abacha, who was head of state at that time. But this is one thing, for whatever else he'd done, but this is one thing he did well because he midwifed it.
Abacha gave his blessing to the Vision 2010 document, and by 1997, for the first time in Nigeria's history, the country had an economic document that planned ahead.
I guess we realized that the nation itself was far more important than the individual or group interests of any one of us. I think that was the central issue. Second, during the formative stages, we were able to sign on to certain values that fostered a very collaborative spirit. The need for us to act in unity and harmony and to see a much higher goal and a much higher platform than our own individual platforms and group interests.
But barely a year after Vision 2010 was adopted, General Abacha was dead. Nigeria was thrown into uncertainty, and the NESG became subsumed in the unfolding political situation.
Unfortunately, Abacha died, unfortunately for Vision 2010, because he had set up a council to implement it. Half of them were ministers, half were private sector people. He was chairman.
The sudden death of Abacha and the speed with which his successor Abdul Salami carried out his transition provided no chance for this kind of thing to be done, because I think from the moment Abacha died, the only thing before the government was to bring back, to keep Nigeria together and to conduct an election and hand over the government.
It was an Indian summer for military rule, as democracy finally dawned for Nigeria. But for the NESG, its mission was unchanged: to help Nigeria build a free market economy and create a future of limitless opportunity. As Nigeria rushed into a democratic future, the NESG's heyday under the country's military rulers drew to a close, and a new chapter in the private sector's advocacy history was ushered in.
When we elected General Obasanjo as president, he wouldn't hear about Vision 2010. And so for 7 years, no question of planning and all that, which we suffered from.
Obasanjo may have relegated the Vision 2010 document, but he didn't discard it completely. Elements of it metamorphosed into a new plan for Nigeria called Vision 2020, which bore the unmistakable imprimatur of the NESG.
Since 2010, there's now 2020, which is like a child of 2010. I am also on the 2020 committee, and the very first meeting we had, the first set of documents given included Vision 2010 document. So 2020 was supposed to use 2010 as a springboard to move on.
First, Obasanjo welcomed it, Yar'Adua did, and under Jonathan, we've now given it flesh. You can now see areas where Nigeria wants to grow, the kind of resources involved and all that. And this has come from private sector push, NESG.
Backed by rigorous research, the NESG continued to create a buzz, becoming more actively involved in the policy-making process. As it pushed both the legislature and the executive for more openness in the economy, the NESG in particular, and the private sector in general, became increasingly visible on the political landscape. The Obasanjo government's economic blueprint called for a more private sector-led economy, and the president and his deputies organized several policy dialogues with the private sector under the umbrella of the NESG. The discussions invariably centered on how to deepen private sector involvement in the economy, and though there were other business groups involved, the NESG soon became the focal point for broad-based